Welcome to Friendship Friday. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. I would like to take a moment just to reflect this afternoon around Mark chapter 5, verse 15, which reads as follows. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Now, I suspect most of us probably know the context of this particular verse. Jesus had come across the Sea of Galilee to the area of the Gerasenes and had met this effectively madman on the banks of the lake. And in conversation, he had driven out the legion of spirits that had controlled his life. And they'd entered into the flock of swine who'd all leapt off into the water. And of course, this was brought to the attention of the local villagers, whose pigs they probably were, and they came to see what was going on. And what is intriguing here is that what has happened actually strikes fear into the villagers' heart, because here is a man for whom a madman, somebody just insane by everybody else's standards, actually healed. Sitting there in his right mind. And their fear is engendered through that. But what this gift is that Jesus gives to the man is that he's able to re-embrace life and the goodness of life. And just it's like his whole life just opens up before him. The evil that is constricted and constrained and held and been so destructive in his experience and in his relationships has just been chased off. And there's this opportunity for him to embrace life. There's an opportunity here, I think, in particular, for growth, an opportunity to just begin life anew. Now, for all of us, that's important. There's a level to which, under lockdown, I think we've all felt hugely constrained. And certainly in South Africa, as the alert levels have dropped, it's been a freeing experience. There's still more freedom that we would love, but opportunities are beginning to show themselves again. There's an opportunity, instead of us just hunkering down, an opportunity to grow again. And growth is so important for our lives and our experience of what it is to be human, and of course to be in relationship one with another. And so growth is an important concept because so much has closed down. How do we rebuild? Or perhaps more importantly, how do we reimagine what life needs to be in today's present, and it is constricted still, but in today's new context. Over the months, I've reflected on and off on aspects of this. But nonetheless, I would like to, in a sense, just revisit something of that. One of the big challenges for growth is that we are needing to move to a point where we're willing to let go of the past. Not to forget the past. I think that's also important. We need to remember the past. But we need to ensure that the past doesn't act a bit like those demons in this man's life, that the past doesn't hold us back from growing and moving forward. Part of the challenge for us as church, of course, is that life is changing around us. And as we know, church and church structures are incredibly slow to move. We're strong, certainly within our Anglican context, we're strong on tradition. And this is how it's always been, and this is how, therefore, it is, and our expectation is that this is how it always will be. But so much has changed, even before the pandemic, that really is necessitating us as church to begin to think differently, begin to be willing to do things differently. And it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not about necessarily even just dreaming up things that will make us uncomfortable. But it's taking time to to really reflect on where the society is in which we minister. There's a sense in which a lot of what we do answers questions that are no longer relevant. They're questions that 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago were deeply relevant in society. And 100 years later, we've eventually caught up with some of those needs. And I often think that actually people 100 years ago would be quite excited about perhaps where we are now, and saying at last the church is doing what it needs to be doing. But of course, it's easy to be in that context also behind the times. And part of the challenge is I think that we put a lot of store in what we see, what is outward. And we often don't realize that a lot of what we do, a lot of what is deeply important to us, really is superficial to the call of the gospel in its essence in our lives. And so part of the challenge that church faces, and of course you and I are the church, so it's the challenge that you and I face, is a willingness to let go of the form, but not the principle of our traditions. And so the difficulty there, of course, is to really come to a point where we're able to ascertain what the principles of our tradition is. Marriage is one of those areas. We talk about until death us do part. What is the principle there? It's not necessarily that every relationship should end in physical death. Relationships themselves die. And we see that in a world where the pressures and the speed of life and change and everything else really undermines an ability to keep those kind of commitments over 50, 60 years maybe. And so I'm not suggesting that we should take marriage lightly, but I'm suggesting that there are other forms of death that ultimately pass us. And I think as a church, we've recognized that some relationships die, and there need to be opportunities for people for new beginnings. So that's not to say that we should take relationships easily. We still need to be very serious about how we hold our long-term relationships. But the key here is that when we speak about until death us do part, it's a commitment to a long-term relationship. It's a commitment to a relationship over a long period of time. It's not just a here today, gone tomorrow, which so much of our consumerist environment, as I was reflecting on Wednesday, impacts on us. It's difficult, hugely difficult, in a world where everything is designed to be thrown away within a very short period of time and something new put in its place. Very difficult to maintain relationships over a long period of time when everything else in our world says we use, we throw away, we buy new. So the challenge of our faith, not just in terms of marriage, but in the breadth of how we do things, is to really say, what are the underlying principles of what we're doing here? And how can the form change and adapt around that? And to move away from saying, because this is how we do it, this is how we're going to continue to do it, and we're going to refuse to let that go. Sometimes the form needs to be let go. It needs to be set free. And we need to then begin to embrace new forms that we build around that principle. But perhaps like a human body, there's a skeleton inside. For those who have sufficient money and things to do, we can go and have plastic surgery and all sorts of things done. We can do a lot to the outside, but essentially there is a structure, a bone structure that holds us and directs us. That's the principle. And we can build things around that. Human beings, we all have bone structures, but we all look quite different on the outside. If we die and you get rid of all the flesh and everything else, and you just end up with a skeleton, most skeletons look pretty much the same. There obviously are differences, and for those who are skilled at looking at them, we'll pick them up. But essentially, it's what's clad to the bones. It's the form that we see and experience and live with. And in terms of our faith and our church experience, a lot of that can be let go of, and new forms can be built around that. And so it's having the wisdom to know when and how and what to put aside, when to release things, and of course how to embrace the new needs. But something like this pandemic really has thrust us into a space, and it's done two things for me. One, it said that a whole lot of things that we didn't believe we could do without, we've had to do without. And we have managed to continue to maintain our faith, sustain our faith, despite a lot of the forms having disappeared. But part of what actually has maintained us through the last 6 or so months is that the underlying principles of what it is to be God's people, to be people of faith, to gather, has all held us. We've just found new ways of doing it. And I'm hugely pleased that we are beginning to move away from just virtual interaction. It's wonderful to see people in the flesh and to have in-person conversations. It really is life-giving. But there have been forms that have been useful, and I suspect will continue to be useful going forward. And so, yeah, I think on this Friendship Friday, I'm wanting to challenge us to really reflect on, what are we holding on to just because it's what makes us feel comfortable? What is it that we've thought for decades, perhaps, are things that if we remove them, our faith and life itself will collapse around us. And in recognizing some of the things that we have let go of and that we've survived despite it and lightning hasn't struck, what are the principles that have enabled that to happen? Principles of faith, principles of relationship, principles of existence. And to really become more conscious of looking for that underlying structure around which our lives and faith and relationships are built, and becoming more at ease with the outer forms that are changing, that have changed, and many that still need to change, and seeing some of the new forms and embracing those as still really relevant, because they are held by principles that have remained steadfast through the last 6 months, and throughout decades, centuries, and even millennia. And to trust that God's Spirit is working in all of that. A bit like the demoniac whose life was really quite radically changed overnight, in a blink of a moment, not just overnight. So this pandemic has been that kind of freeing up for us. An act of God, as you may want to consider it, that really has kind of shattered our previous perceptions. And as difficult as that letting go has been and continues to be, that in the opportunities moving forward, there is this wonderful space as we bring our shattered lives back together to rebuild. And again, to go back, even rebuild not being the right word, but to reimagine and to rebuild around our reimaginings, not to rebuild as it was. And to trust that in that, as church, we become more relevant to the call of God on our lives and more relevant to the needs of the society that God calls us to serve.